Welcome, welcome, welcome. Part of our continuing series where we talk to activists, reporters, writers, philosophers, and professors. Left coast, west coast, east coast, right coast, middle of America, anywhere we can find them, as long as they're experts and have done original research and thinking on the topic of political polarization. We want to present their information directly to you, unedited and unaltered, so that you could do this thing that was popular when I was in high school called thinking for yourself. Maybe it'll come back. Maybe it never will. With us today, it's our privilege to have Gregory, Department of Political Science at the world-famous Yale University. He's the Forrest Family Professor of Political Science, Chair, Department of Political Science, Director, Center of the Study of American Politics, Director, ISPS Behavioral Research Lab, and the Resident Fellow at the Institution for Social and Policy Studies. Princeton University since 2001. We've already covered some of those. Sorry. Yale University Department of Political Science since 2000. Professor since 2011 to present. Associate professor there also. Also director for the Study of American Politics, 2021. Associate director, 2016 to 21. Director of Graduate Studies, 2011 to 2014. Acting director, Institution for Social and Policy Studies. Research affiliate, Yale University, resident fellow, Center for Study of American Politics, and resident fellow, Institute for Social and Policy Studies. Also, the Brookings Institute, Government Studies 99 and 2000, and the Robert Hartley Fellowship in Government Studies. Princeton University Department of Politics, University of Michigan, and the Emory University Department of Political Science. Very well educated. Some of the peer review works the professor has worked on is testing persuasive messaging to encourage COVID-19 risk reduction. Mass support for proposals to reshape policy depends on implications for crime and safety. House members in the news. Observational open science and application to the literature on irrelevant events and voting behavior with the, very famous Neil Malhotra. Can raising the stakes of election outcomes increase participation? Identifying legitimacy, experimental evidence on compliance with authority. So a lot on COVID-19 and a lot on elections, and very well educated and researched. This is the study where I found the professor, but before we get into that, let's check in and see how we did. Professor, did I say anything wrong? Is there anything I need to correct, sir?
Huber, not Huber.
Huber. Huber. We're going to write that down. Huber. Thank you. Sorry. Huber, Professor Huber. I was really pleased to run into this study and to be able to interview you. When I started this series, interviewing professors on political polarization and reading about it, one of the things that almost stopped me in my tracks was there seemed to be this indelible debate amongst very smart people on both sides who had a lot of good information. And it went, it's the elites that are polarized, and it's not the people at all. No. It's the people who are polarized, not just the elites. And you had Morris Fiorina versus Abramowitz. Why is this a debate in political science? How long has this been a debate? And is it a big debate on if it's the elites or it's the people causing all the mischief in America?
Well, I would say that actually both Fiorina and Abramowitz are right, but they're right about different things. So the way Fiorina's right is to say that as much as the elites are polarized, the masses are much less polarized. So when you talk about, for example, abortion attitudes within the parties, you would get the impression that from looking at the elites, that the Democrats are abortion on demand up until birth, and Republicans believe you should never be able to have an abortion. And while that might be an accurate summary of elite opinion, it's not an accurate summary of mass opinion. And that's true for most issues where the mass public is much less polarized than the elites. Abramowitz's point is that starting in about the mid-1970s, the parties have become more polarized at the mass level, but that's talking about a change rather than a degree. And so we would say that members of the mass parties are more polarized than they used to be on salient issues. So for example, in the 70s, the parties weren't polarized on abortion, and now they are, but it is not to the degree to which the elites are polarized.
Okay. not to the degree the elites are polarized. Before we get into the research, why did Abramowitz and Fiorina have such a big conflict initially? I mean, why? And I've heard other people talk about this. Why was this such a big debate? Why couldn't people come to consensus? Why did it take your study to, with Orr and Fowler, to bring some consensus to this? These guys have been going at it for years.
Well, I would say that actually that debate is about whether or not people are polarized in terms of the opinions that they hold and whether or not there's stark differences between the parties. So to answer that question, you really need to look at the issue by issue question of whether or not Democrats and Republicans hold different policy opinions. And part of what I like about both of that sets of work is it somewhat depends on what your metric is. If your metric is, I don't like the other side, people look pretty polarized. If the metric is, what are our actual concrete abortion opinions, people look less polarized. So partially it depends on the survey data, the survey outcome that are being used. They're both right about what their core argument is. Fiorina's core argument is that the mass public is much less polarized than the elites on policy. And Abramowitz's core argument is that the parties have become ideologically purer over time. Those are both true. And I don't think of them as at all incompatible. In fact, I assign both of them as people who talk about issues mattering. And if you wanted to transition into what the paper that you're talking about, that I wrote, was about, it was about why don't Democrats and Republicans on average, why aren't they excited about one another? So if you go to a Democrat and say, how warmly do you feel towards a Republican? People say, well, I feel cold. I don't like Republicans. And then the question is, why don't they like Republicans? In one view, they don't like Republicans because they're Republicans. It's like being a White Sox fan or being a Yankees fan. Mm-hmm. But another possibility is, consistent with both Fiorina and Abramowitz, is that on average, Democrats have left-wing positions. And when I ask you to think about a Republican, you think about someone with right-wing positions. And you think, I don't like that person not because they're a Republican, but because they hold policy opinions that I disagree with. And so the key initial question that motivates this work is, underneath this thing that we measure, which is how we feel towards the other party, are we measuring something about being a partisan, or are we measuring something that's correlated with being a partisan? And so, for example, if we were to think about it in the sports world, if you're, let's say, a Yankees fan, you may hate the Red Sox. And that's actually a true, I hate the other team. On the other hand, if you're a Democrat and you say you don't like Republicans, you might actually dislike people because they're Republicans, but you might dislike them because you think they vote for a bad candidate. You might dislike them because they have different policy opinions. And it really matters if it's really like a sports team conflict where there's no underneath it like rational basis except where you grew up. It's a very different world than if you're like, well, I don't like Republicans because I disagree with them about things that are very important. And in that world, if I could learn that we could agree about things, we might be able to get along. So underneath that, it's not about partisanship itself, it's about policy.
So the debate is that people have real policy differences, and that's what's causing polarization in America. There has been some confusion on if it was just identity politics. Obviously, identity politics has some position to play. I think I saw in your research that there's some data, but I think you're arguing that most of the polarization is based upon real substantive policy differences. Is that a fair statement?
And when we say polarization, we should be clear that we mean affective polarization.
Affective polarization.
The difference between how much I like people in my party versus how much I like people in the out party. And we often measure that using a feeling thermometer where we say 0 to 100, 0 is very cold and 100 is warm. How do you feel towards both parties? And if you rate your own party more warmly than the out party, that difference is what we think of as partisan animosity, how much you dislike the other side compared to your own.
Right. And it would be fair to say that that's been growing. The feeling thermometers have been showing, I think, since the 1970s and 1990s, increase less warm feelings to the other side. Would that be fair?
They have been growing. And there's some recent good work by Iyengar and others showing that they've grown over time, in part because of the way we've measured this. So we've changed the survey. In part because when we ask these questions in a political survey, people are turned on to politics. We're really making clear that we're asking about something that's high stakes. That might exacerbate polarization. But despite those things, polarization still has gone up, which is how much we like the other side has gone down compared to how much we like our own side.
Before I get into more of the specifics on the research, just something we always ask everybody. Is political polarization bad? Or do we need to not worry? It's not that bad. We've gone through tough times before. It's fine. Or is this something new and dangerous and scary, and we should be appropriately concerned?
I don't study polarization per se. And if polarization is the difference between Democrats and Republicans on average in their policy opinions, there's other excellent work that suggests, on the one hand, there's papers finding that if we increase polarization or increase animosity, it doesn't seem to increase support for Democratic backsliding or changing the rules of elections or things like that. But there's also work that suggests people who perceive the other side as ideologically very distant from you might be more willing to, quote, cheat in order to make sure that their side wins. And that's not just Republicans, it's both sides are willing to trade off policy against fairness. So that's not what we're working on in this paper. I tend to be more hopeful, which is to say that we disagree about a lot of things, but we also agree about a lot of things. And since politics is not about the things that we agree about, because we don't have to talk about them, we only have to talk about things that we disagree, we tend to focus on disagreement and miss areas where there's widespread agreement.
You said there's a study that showed that increasing polarization does not necessarily increase dysfunction of government.
Westwood and Kalla have done some experimental evidence showing that increasing animosity does not lead to changes in support for democratic norms. Actually, I think they find that decreasing animosity does not lead to increasing support for democratic norms.
I could see that.
And on the other side is the work by Svolik and Graham, who find that people who perceive starker differences between the parties on policy terms are more likely to trade off fairness against winning.
I've seen a lot of evidence on, especially after reading Liliana Mason, that if you believe your side is right and the other side is bad, that all sorts of behaviors become acceptable to far too many humans. Let me read the abstract of the paper. Partisan Americans like members of their own party more than members of the opposing party. Scholars often interpret this as evidence that party identity or loyalty influence interpersonal affect. First, we reassess previous studies and demonstrate that prior results are also consistent with what we would predict if people cared about only policy agreement. Next, we demonstrate the difficulty of manipulating perceptions of party identity without also manipulating beliefs about policy agreement and vice versa. Finally, we show that partisans care much more about policy agreement than they do about party loyalty when the two come into conflict. Our analysis suggests that partisan Americans care about policy agreement. We have little convincing evidence that they care about partisan identity or loyalty per se, and scholars will have to find new research designs if they want to convincingly estimate the effects of identity and loyalty independent of policy substance. It sounds like you're calling out the academic community a little bit in saying there seems to be this discussion on identity forces us to become partisans, and whoa, that's not exactly accurate. We're finding out that real substantive policy differences are always at the root of affective polarization. Is that fair?
Well, in concrete terms, what we find is if you have to choose between a partisan who you disagree with on some salient issue. So let's say you're a pro-choice Democrat,
okay,
and you encounter a Republican who's pro-choice, or you could encounter a Democrat who's pro-life. What we find is you'd prefer the person who agrees with you on abortion, even if they're in the out party, to someone who's in your party that you disagree with. And the difference between a Republican and a Democrat who agrees with you on abortion is very small compared to the difference between a Democrat and Republican who disagree on the abortion issue, in which case you prefer the person who agrees with you on the substantive issue. So it's not that partisanship doesn't matter. It's that partisanship matters to us because it sends us a very strong signal about other policy commitments. But when you learn those policy commitments, you don't have to fill in the blank. When the person comes up to you and tells them to you, then you don't rely on partisanship anymore. You rely on the actual policy commitments of that person to decide whether or not you like them. So partisanship is a marker for our policy and value agreement rather than something we primitively care about. It's just correlated.
I see you as a Republican. I know that you would vote this way on these other issues that are important to me. You would vote the same way that I would on these important issues. And I can just assume that because you're a Republican versus previous professors and researchers who said, I don't even think about the policy. I just see you as a Republican. I immediately feel a sense of hate, and I don't want to vote for anything you're saying. I think you're saying the identity gives markers or cues for the voting patterns.
Exactly. And so it's a partisanship, unlike, for example, sports team alliances, which often are where one grew up, are something we tend to choose based on other commitments and values. And they signal policy preferences and who we vote for. And you can think back to the 2016 election. There were a lot of Republicans who said they wouldn't vote for Donald Trump, and a lot of Democrats who voted for a Republican for the first time in a long time. And they showed up at Thanksgiving, and a Republican who stood up and said, I didn't vote for Donald Trump, probably was received very differently by their Democratic friends than a Democrat who showed up and said they voted for Donald Trump. Partisanship was a very good predictor of who you voted for, but what we cared about was who you voted for, not your partisanship.
That's a brilliant example. I do, yeah, because when I was hearing this theory, I'm like, what? But what you said just makes sense. If you showed up in 2016 and you said, I'm a lifelong Democrat, but I voted for Trump, you're not going to be treated well by the other liberals. But if you're one of the never Trump Republicans, they seem to have carved out a space, and that switched instantly. Interesting. I know we have limited time. I do have to ask you though about, I pulled a lot of stuff out, but I do got to ask you about surveys. We note that the same considerations are likely to also be relevant in analyses of survey data that rely on measures of social identity, because such identity appears to be interpreted in part as a measure of policy preferences. What do you mean about problems with survey data, Professor?
Well, so for example, a common way to measure my social attachment to a party is to ask a question like, when someone criticizes your party, it feels like they're criticizing you. And people who score highly that way are perceived to be strong partisans. Or for example, when I talk about my party, I use the term we to just, so you describe, like, I'm a Yankees fan. It's the side that I'm on. And so we've interpreted that to be a measure of partisanship as a social identity, but it might also simply be a marker of partisanship as a summary of your policy and value commitments. So we need to be careful. And in fact, if I simply came up to you and said, this person thinks of themselves as a strong Republican, they use the word we when they talk about Republicans, and then I asked you to guess their policy positions, you would guess that Republican had more conservative policy positions than a Republican who said, when I talk about Republicans, I use the word they. So the survey measures that we think of as measuring the social identity to partisanship are interpreted by people as communicating policy and value commitments, not just membership on the partisan team.
So some of the survey data we're getting may not be accurate. People may be misinterpreting what the survey givers are actually asking for.
Well, I don't think it's inaccurate. I think it has to be with how people understand partisanship, which is, in their mind, when you say I'm a strong Republican, you're communicating that you are someone who holds on average more Republican views. If you say I'm not a very strong Republican, you're communicating to someone that you are not as conservative. We use this language in ordinary conversation. When we communicate our strength of partisanship, we communicate our value commitments. Survey respondents similarly describe their partisan identity using a similar set of words. So they think of stronger Republicans as more conservative compared to weaker Republicans. And in fact, the survey items that we've interpreted as measures of identity may actually therefore be measures of policy and value commitments, not just partisanship per se.
I'm sure I'm not going to phrase this the correct way, but I've done a lot of research on this. A lot of people said They're just mad at identity, and that's what's forming them. And you're saying, well, identity is really a cue of policy. How did so many academics get it wrong or come to a different conclusion for so long?
I mean, I think it's partisanship is clearly highly predictive. And so it's a question of, we've never really forced ourselves to take this concept apart. And of course, even if we think that partisanship is important because it communicates value commitments, it's not that we're saying partisanship is unimportant. It's important precisely because, as Abramowitz and others have pointed out, and even Fiorina, partisanship does communicate those policy and value commitments, and it increasingly does so on polarized issues. But the question is it about identity or is it about policy?
Right.
And I think we've just haven't dug in on that because it hasn't really been ripe for a long time. And this is something where, working with Lila Ora, now with Anthony Fowler, we've written a couple papers on this saying, let's hold off on assuming it's about your team and start to think about whether or not it's about the thing we're fighting about that leads us to pick a team in the first place.
Yes, we're not going to be able to get to all of them, but there's Webster and Abramowitz. When one learns about a person's partisan affiliation, they may update their beliefs about the person's policy position. So even if they only care about policy and not about partisan identity itself, they will shift their views of that person in response to partisan information. I think that's what you're saying. Secondly, we experimentally demonstrate that information about partisan identity influences belief about policy positions, and information about policy positions influences belief about identity and other policy positions. Therefore, separately, estimating the effects of identity and substance is more difficult than previously thought. I sense that you were saying, hey, we need a lot more research in this area, that this was, you weren't trying to end the subject with this paper, but kind of invite people to continue to study this more.
That's right. And I think it's important because there are issues that cut across the party spectrum. And when they start to emerge, when new issues start to emerge, it could be that the parties aren't very polarized. And so we have a hard time inferring which party is going to be our side. This is how abortion emerged in the early 70s. Abortion was an issue where Republicans on average were more pro-choice than were Democrats. And so if abortion was important to you, you couldn't infer policy positions from that. So I think as new issues emerge, one of the questions is, if people are cross-pressured, if they have opinions that don't fit perfectly with the party system, or the party system doesn't provide them with a clear guide about which party's on their side, do we see these same effects, and how do those issues evolve over time? So I think this is an area for ongoing research. An issue I would have not expected, two issues that I would not expected to turn out the way they've turned out, are Ukraine and Israel, where the Democrats have become more hawkish on Ukraine and Republicans have become more hawkish on Israel. That is not what one would have predicted a decade ago. And so these are dynamic over time based on decisions that are made by political elites, and it influences how we feel about people. And we ought to understand whether or not ordinary survey respondents care about partisanship, or, for example, the candidates' policy positions on those specific topics.
Those are two great examples you've had. We don't hear that too often. One last question. Let's see here. People sometimes shift their identities to match their political ideologies, Egan, or in response to politicians' current performance, and they sometimes shift their policy positions to align with their partisan identities. As we demonstrate experimentally, exogenous treatments that influence perceptions of another person's partisan identity or party loyalty will likely also influence perceptions of the person's policy positions. That doesn't exactly get to the question I want to ask you, but there's a theory that I'm not polarized, I'm just a voter. And then I see Donald Trump tell me it's okay to be polarized, or Joe Biden tell me it's okay to be polarized. And then because of elite cues, I suddenly become polarized. How powerful are elite cues in this scenario, Professor?
I don't know. This isn't in my area of research. And you mentioned Liliana Mason's work. I think her work and some others, Brendan Nyhan, have really thought about the way in which we've always thought of elites, particularly presidents, senators, etc., as behaving in a way that says, even if I lose, there's a sense of decorum, and there's a way in which you talk about the other side. There's a way in which you can think of Al Gore in 2000.
Yep.
He probably lost that election because of a bad ballot design in Palm Beach County, and he goes quietly into the night. And there's a sense in which I don't know the answer to this question, but other smart scholars are working on what happens when elites demonstrate bad behavior or seem to make it acceptable in order to engage in anti-democratic action. And certainly there are other countries around the world where elites have done this, and we've seen democracies fall apart. So we really worry about standard setting by elites.
Fascinating. Okay. Last question. You're not you. You're not me. You're a third-party person watching this interview. Wow, did they learn a lot? Things they haven't heard. And they said, I'm struggling to remember it all, but there was this one thing the professor said about polarization. I can't get out of my head. What is that one thing?
Partisan animosity appears to be largely driven by policy conflict rather than partisanship per se.
Okay. Wow. We'll end it there. I'll send you a copy of the video. You don't have to answer, but we always ask if you have any recommendations of other people who might be open to an honest interview. We'd love it. You don't have to name anybody. I'll ask you in the email when I send you the video.
Thank you very much. It's nice to meet you.
Thank you.